Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming today. My name is Steven Siciliano. I'm the president of the Traverse Area Historical Society. And as I see that we have a number of visitors today, I'd like to just give you a brief overview of our organization. We are a nonprofit 501c3, and our mission is to preserve, protect, and present the history of the Grand Traverse region. Activities include programs such as this, historical tours, archive support, scholarship support, and support of local history initiatives. We are all volunteer organization. We're governed by a board of directors that we meet monthly upstairs in the Nelson Room, and those meetings are open to the public. The revenues from our membership and donations will allow us to put on events like today. Today's program is, as you see, Legacy, Perry Hanna and his neighbors, and our presenter is the vice president of our board, Marty MacLeod. I'd like to welcome her to the podium, and please welcome her.
Yeah, everyone. I asked them to bring me this chair because I thought I might be taller. Look, it's exactly the same. So you get what you get. So before we move on from the slide, I actually had intended really to talk about it. What this is Central Neighborhood, essentially. This is Union Street, and these are all buildings. And look, there's nothing in the entire Central Neighborhood. So this except possibly this school. But I think that's pretty funny. And you might not have noticed it. So my talk today, I am basing it on the second neighborhood book that I wrote. It's called Perry Hanna and His Neighbors. And it's Central Neighborhood as it was right around the turn of the, right around 1900 when Perry Hanna was there. And I just wanted to make one comment because it was so telling when I was researching and writing that book. How lucky Traverse City was to have someone like Perry Hanna, who was really foresightful and really cared about his little town, Traverse City. And, you know, he made his fortune, but he was interested in so much more than that. And Traverse City was very lucky. And he understood how important it was that his contemporaries also succeeded as well, and that it was unusual with many of his contemporaries. But it was that civic mindedness that has really made Traverse City what it is, and I do hope we can recapture a little bit of a sense of that. So here in a nutshell are some stories of folks who made lasting contributions to Traverse City. And I'll begin with Mr. Hanna's. I'm sure most, if not all of you, know what Perry Hanna looks like. Traverse City's story is inextricable from his, and it actually begins in Chicago. So the Chicago of 1850, at that point, was still just a small boom town, and among its recent arrivals were Perry Hanna from Port Huron, Michigan, and Tracy Lay from New York. They were two ambitious young men still in their 20s, and they met and they hit it off, and along with the two Morgan brothers, who were their silent partners, they formed a wholesale lumber business in May 1851 under the name Hanna, Lay and Company. So this is, sorry, wrong toy. This is Tracy Lay, this is Perry Hanna, and the other two are the Morgans. So the men were eager to cut out the middlemen and develop their own standing timber resources. And so they sought the acquaintance of Captain Harry Boardman. Captain Boardman was a wealthy Illinois farmer who had purchased government land at the head of Grand Traverse Bay in 1847 and had sent his son Horace to establish a sawmill. After 3 years, the small water-powered mill was not living up to expectations. So Captain Boardman was considering selling. And he and Perry Hannah sailed north. And when they landed, they went to the sawmill and discovered Horace and his entire crew whiling away the gloomy day cards. And that pretty much clinched the deal for Boardman Sr. Hannah took off to survey the Boardman River Valley, and within a week estimated that he had seen about 100 million board feet of virgin pine. So he closed the deal, and for the grand sum of $4,500, Hannah and Lay and company acquired Boardman's sawmill and 200 acres of pine forest where downtown Traverse City now stands. So I wanted to include this, and I've superimposed the colorful important bits on top of a much later map. Because of course, what you have to understand is there's not a single street at the time. So this is just to orient you, all of you. So here's the original Boardman sawmill, and they had established a wood tram that got the lumber that they cut out to the dock that they built. After Hannah and Lay bought it, they built a second tramway that came from the Boardman River to the mill and then out to the dock. This area highlighted in purple was the original Slabtown area. And this was where Perry Hannah built his house eventually. So I think that's all you need to know at this point. Anyway, the partners, the new partners, lost no time in converting that little sawmill to steam power. And in 1858, they built a much larger sawmill farther downstream. And that is right here. And then these were the new docks that they built. All right. And that's the second sawmill. And that's the Boardman River right there. So Perry Hannah and Tracy Lay originally were going to split their time 6 months each between Chicago and Traverse City. And Lay was going to be here in the summer months and Hannah in the winter months, which was when much of the lumbering work was being done. But pretty quickly they decided that it made more sense to have Lay stay in Chicago at company headquarters and Perry Hannah stay up here to handle all things operational. So over the next 35 years, the company bought thousands more acres of virgin forest and harvested more than 400 million feet of old growth timber. So this ledge is on Union Street near the corner of Front Street. Union Street at the time was basically just a logging road for convenience. But it wasn't lumber all of the time. Unlike the fellow lumber barons of the day who denuded one forest before moving on to the next, Perry Hannah was looking to diversify the company's interests and encourage the little village of Traverse City to grow. And he meant to supply all its needs. The Hannah Lay Mercantile Building still stands at Front and Union Streets. Dealers in everything, they proclaimed, and they displayed a larger stock than Chicago's Marshall Field's department store in over 2 acres of showroom. The shoe department. The company also built docks, bridges. This is the original Union Street Bridge. Dams. and a huge grist mill to supply flour and animal feed for the little village. To absolutely no one's surprise, Perry Hanna was elected village president and eventually the little town's first mayor. So this is one of the, if not the earliest views of Front Street in the 1860s. And as you can see, all of the buildings are on the south side of the street facing the water. From 1857 to 1859, Perry Hanna also represented Northern Michigan in the state legislature. Every winter, with the help of an Anishinaabe guide, he spent 2 weeks snowshoeing on Indian trails down to the month-long February meetings in the new capital of Lansing, and that's our first state capitol building. There, he quickly became known as a strong leader who got things done and done quickly, which served him well personally, of course, but also came to greatly benefit Traverse City as well. It's hard to appreciate now how very isolated Traverse City was for the first 10 or 15 years. Folks referred to leaving town as going outside. There were no roads other than Indian trails and certainly no railroads. The only way to get here was by water, and then only during the 8-9 months that Lake Michigan was navigable. But then in 1862, the governor appointed Perry Hanna chairman of a commission that had been stymied for ages. And they were charged with building the first road into northern Michigan. And within just this is 2. Tell me when I'm getting behind, okay? This is early Traverse City in the winter, and you can see what a problem that might have been. All right. In 1862, he was put on the commission to bring the first road into northern Michigan. And within just 3 weeks of Perry Hanna taking charge, the committee had let all the contracts for the 99-mile Newaygo to Northport State Road. So this is the very beginnings of M37. Perry Hanna also lobbied hard to convince railroad magnates to expand into the region. And the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad began inching northward from Chicago in 1869. In November 1872, local church bells rang and there was dancing in the street when the first engine chugged into the new depot at the north end of Park Street. This was Traverse City's first real connection to the outside world, and it changed everything. The Grand Traverse Herald published a stirring essay entitled Out of the Wilderness. But it was less than a year later that a second essay was published, The Railroad Brings All, and it complained mightily about all the riffraff the trains were bringing to town. In 1881, the governor again appointed Perry Hanna chairman of a commission, this time to select the site for an asylum in northern Michigan. 5 towns of comparable size were in the running: Traverse City, Big Rapids, Cadillac, Greenville, and Reed City. Traverse City won out, surprise, officially at least because of the vast artesian water reserves. But no matter the reason, the result was that the state pumped $300 million into the asylum between 1885 and 1900, and the local economy flourished. Perry Hanna truly enjoyed being right in the thick of things. Here's the house on Bay Street, the little green square that I showed you earlier, where he and Anne raised their 3 kids. And this ended up being his front yard. You can actually see the house, different toy, way up in the corner here. That was the house in the last slide. So the story goes that Hanna wandered down to the company docks one evening, just checking to see that all was well. And the night watchman didn't recognize him, nabbed him for trespassing and locked him up. So you can imagine the next morning the chagrin and trepidation that was discovered who the nefarious trespasser was. But Hannah simply commended the watchman for his diligence, and he went home and had breakfast. So Perry Hannah truly was a legend in his own time. When school board members visited a primary classroom in October of 1892 and were quizzing the young pupils on who had discovered America, and one little girl raised her hand and waved it in the air, and she said, "It was Mr. Hannah." But as early as 1886, he was already thinking ahead to when the lumber trade must, of course, peter out. And not long after, he sold his valuable timber holdings and the sawmill operation for $800,000. I don't know, I didn't look up the rate, but I know in 1900 it was about $36 to $1. So multiply 800,000 by 36 to get an idea, and more to get an idea. Anyway, the sale freed his considerable energies and his immense fortune to concentrate on shipping, mercantile interests, and building Traverse City into the Queen City of the North. And the last 2 decades of the 19th century was a period of spectacular growth. So this is pretty much the same view as that first one I showed you from 1860, so in 40 years. Perry Hannah was known for his generous donations of land. Although not religious himself, he gave prime real estate for churches all over town. Here, for example, is the original Church of Christ on the corner of 8th and Cass Street, which is now, of course, the Old Town Playhouse. The First Congregational, which is this one, and the First Presbyterian Church over there, are now conjoined, and they serve as the County District Courthouse on Washington Street. And behind that stands Temple Beth El. If you've never found it, you should take a little tour. It is the longest continuously occupied synagogue in the entire state of Michigan. Hannah also donated land for 6 large primary schools, and this is the original Central Grade School building. 2 libraries. This is, of course, the Carnegie Library and the Ladies Library, where this is just being built here, and that's on Cass Street. 62 acres of Oakwood Cemetery here on Memorial Day in 1900. The county courthouse on the left and the original jail on the right, and other public spaces, including the first golf course in town, which was actually on 10th Street. The land for Hannah Park wasn't donated until 1902. Portions of it had previously served as the village's first cemetery, the town dump, and a rollway for logs destined for the company sawmill. A deer park was created in 1911, and 1,000 rose bushes were planted. Financed by Perry Hannah and Tracy Lay, the Traverse City State Bank was built in 1904. It underwrote most new businesses in town, and many of which were in direct competition with Hannah and Lay, and started by its former employees. In the 1850s, the company had employed virtually 100% of the region's labor force, and by 1900, it was only 20%. So Hannah understood the value of keeping talented entrepreneurs right here in Traverse City rather than having them leave to make their fortunes elsewhere. Hannah Lay and Company bought and completely remodeled Campbell House Hotel in 1879, doubling its capacity. They renamed it the Park Place, and it claimed to offer the most luxurious accommodations north of Grand Rapids. Hannah also promoted a fierce tourism campaign, if you're in Michigan, ensuring that copies of the Herald were distributed up and down the East Coast. His Come to Traverse City ads, with their glowing reports about our climate, appeared in all the New York papers. Hannah personally escorted any distinguished visitors around town, and he took them for evening cruises on his yacht, the company's yacht, City of Traverse. And it was impressive. At 226 feet, she had luxurious accommodations for 75 and could carry 640,000 feet of lumber. It was only after Perry Hanna bowed to popular pressure and built his fabulous mansion in 1893 that 6th Street became a fashionable address, and what we now call Central Neighborhood began to expand much beyond Union Street. Houses started sprouting up from 5th to 9th Street to accommodate Traverse City's burgeoning population. So here you see the Hanna Mansion. This is the second version of Central Grade School. And there was a house here, and here, and here on 6th Street. But these photos do give a sense of how very empty Central Neighborhood was until 1900. So this is from the top of that school tower, looking obviously north toward the bay. And this is Slabtown. It's much further east than we think of it today. Yes. This one?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Now, your first map of Slabtown, as I looked at it, seemed more over toward Central Neighborhood. And where was the Hanna house?
So the Hanna house is to the right off of the picture. So this, whoops, sorry. This is the Boardman River, and this is the Big Bend coming around. So this is Wadsworth Street right here. And Slabtown was just to the west of Wadsworth.
Perry Hanna's original house on this slide.
On this slide, Wadsworth, it was, yeah, it was not far from Slabtown. It was probably right in here somewhere. I can't distinguish it from the buildings there though. Okay, let's see. So here's another view. You can see the house being built. Again, the Hanna Mansion is way off to the left here, and this is just about where the river swings around to come back through downtown. So, pretty empty. So it didn't take long for many of Perry Hanna's new neighbors to make their own lasting mark on Traverse City. And here are the stories of those very civic-minded folks whose contributions are evident today. This is Frank Friedrich. His family emigrated from Bohemia and moved to Traverse City in 1873, when Frank's father bought the Front Street House Hotel. When his father died shortly thereafter, Frank took over management at the tender age of 17, and people were always confusing him with the bellhop. In 1883, he opened his first shoe store on Front Street, and that was a business in which he would remain for the rest of his life. Friedrichs eventually became Friedrich Golden, and of course now is Golden Shoes. Frank's store was a gathering place for fellow merchants, and it was at one of these meetings that the Businessmen's Association was organized, and it was the first such group in the whole state. Back in 1873, when Howard Whiting was just 19, he borrowed $300 from Perry Hanna to open a small grocery store on Union Street. He repaid it within months, and it was the first and last time he was ever in debt. He built the popular Whiting Hotel, which is still above Cherry Republic, Front Street, and it was replete with a barber shop, a billiards room, a smoke shop, a saloon, a restaurant, and a library. He and his son George sold farm supplies, and they opened the first Chevy dealership in town. George became a successful horse trainer and a fanatic harness racer. Here he is. So Howard built a livery and a sales barn on State Street, and he bought the Driving Association's 40-acre park way out east of town, which eventually became the county fairgrounds and now is the Civic Center. So those of you who live in town, next Halloween, when you go down 6th Street and you go past the Whiting House around Halloween, you can fully appreciate why there is an old sulky with a life-size skeleton horse and jockey in the front yard. That was Howard's house and George's house. So I call this the Votruba Bartak Wilhelm trifecta. Frank Votruba was born in Bohemia, where he apprenticed in harness making. And he came to Traverse City in 1878 and opened a leather repair shop in a shack on North Union Street. Tony Bartak was the son of Bohemian emigres, and he was born here in 1858, making him one of the earliest pioneers to spend his entire life in the Grand Traverse area. Charlie Wilhelm was also a second-generation Bohemian, and the three ended up as brothers-in-law. So the guys opened a modest grocery, dry goods, and harness shop on Front Street in 1879, and they did quite well. But eventually they required larger premises, and they spoke with Perry Hanna and followed his advice and invested in a large new building that included a meeting hall and a theater on the upper floors. And so in 1891, the City Opera House opened with much fanfare above their individual shops, as you can see below. And both Votruba's Leather and City Opera House live on 135 years later. This gentleman was Smith Barnes, and he had overseen the Hannah Lay mercantile operations for decades. Upon his death, he left his second wife, Catherine, a very wealthy young widow. As you might suspect from this fabulous portrait, Katie Barnes was a determined sort of woman, and she decided to go into the real estate and building business. Highly unusual move for the times. Over a century later, it's not so easy to trace all of what she might have built, but at least 3 prestigious homes that she built and sold still stand on 6th Street. In 1859, Parmius Gilbert was one of the first graduates of the new Traverse City Central High School. He went on to, there's a better view of the high school. He went on to the U of M Law Department and became the first city attorney, negotiating Traverse City's incorporation in 1895. He was elected circuit court judge in 1929 and served until ill health forced him to retire at 80. We have him to thank for introducing many of the state's prison reforms still in effect today. He also donated Gilbert Lodge on Long Lake, which served as 4-H headquarters for decades, and also hosted Camp Royale for otherwise abled kids. In 1885, Dr. James Decker Munson arrived by train in Traverse City with his wife Mary and 43 patients in tow. He immediately set about transforming regional mental health care as the first superintendent of the Northern Michigan Asylum for the Insane. He served nearly 40 years until 1924, and it was widely viewed as one of the finest institutions of its kind in the country. When the city's only medical hospital burned in 1915, Munson modified a building on the asylum grounds to tend to both the asylum patients and the public. He tapped nurse Jenny Lease to establish a nursing school in the facility as well. Munson was quick to see the potential of Traverse City, and he built 3 commercial buildings on Front Street and also served as director of the First National Bank and chairman of its building committee. And you might recognize this as Sparks Barbecue. So just a few doors down lived Michigan's foremost family physician, Edwin Thirlby. Encouraged by Munson, he graduated from the U of M Medical School in 1903, and he returned back to Traverse City to lobby hard for a community hospital. As a result, the 55-bed James Decker Munson Hospital was completed in 1925. And this building is actually still there at the very back of the current hospital complex. You can see it if you find it if you look for it. Dr. Ted, as he was known around town, also founded the Thirlby Clinic, which was one of the first group practices in the whole state. A lifelong athlete, he co-founded the Traverse City Golf and Country Club. That's him at the far left. On the top of Buffy Hill in 1915. And of course, Thirlby Field was named in his honor, opened in 1934. Julius Steinberg emigrated to the US as a very young man, escaping from Russian-occupied Poland disguised as a woman. I venture to say that was before the beard. Arriving here from Detroit, he started as a peddler, literally carrying a backpack, and then partnered in a clothing store. Julius struck out on his own in 1879, and business at Steinberg's dry goods store boomed. By 1891, he controlled 124 feet along East Front Street and decided to demolish the structures and build anew. The top floors became Steinberg's Grand Opera House, considered the finest theater north of Chicago. When moving pictures made their debut, Steinberg opened the smaller Lyric Theater on the right, right next door, and that is now the state. As a very young child, Moselle Bennett was encouraged to give poetry recitations. One evening at the City Opera House performance, the 5-year-old recited Little Orphaned Annie by James Whitcomb Riley. And in a moment that Perry Hannah never forgot, she pointed straight at him from the stage with the final lines, "And the goblins will get you if you don't watch out." She trained as a concert violinist. Her father had given her her first violin at the age of 8, and he walked home at lunchtime from his Front Street jewelry store just to hear her practice every day. But she went off to New York and performed for the likes of the Rockefellers at Carnegie Hall. But for a couple of years, rather than pursuing fame and fortune, Moselle followed her heart. She returned to Traverse City to marry Charlie Sawyer. Charlie Sawyer, who had to promise his grudging new father-in-law that he would always employ domestic help so that Moselle could continue to play her violin. And so she did. In 1932, she co-founded the Traverse City Musicale, which is a group that provided scholarships to promising young musicians. And this group is last year's awardees. She continued to open her home for poetry readings and concerts until her death in 1989 at the age of 97. As for Charlie, he was the city engineer in the 1930s, and his lasting claim to fame was designing the miniature Traverse City. It was a huge attraction for many decades at Clinch Park, and you can still see portions of it at the Music House in Acme. As a child, Eugene Power, who's on the right, that's his brother, on the left, was known around the neighborhood as Beanie. As an adult, Gene split his time between Traverse City and Ann Arbor and is credited with inventing micropublishing. Throughout World War II, his company microfilmed tens of thousands of priceless rare books at British museums and libraries to ensure their preservation. And he was knighted for that work by Queen Elizabeth in the 1970s, Traverse City's one and only. Gene bought and refurbished the Park Place. Whoop, sorry, there he was. Gene bought and refurbished the Park Place in 1963, and 20 years later, sorry. There, I'll do this. And 20 years later, he renamed Marion Island Power Island in honor of his parents and donated it to Grand Traverse County. An entire book has been written about Jens Petersen. He was born in 1873 and moved here with his family at 11. And he trained with his father building all of the cottages up at the asylum. But he wanted much more than to be a bricklayer for the rest of his life. So thanks to correspondence courses at night school and apprenticing with a well-known architecture firm in Chicago, Petersen became the first licensed architect in northern Michigan in 1903. By 1906, he was well known in the field and selling over 300 mail order home building plans as far away as South America. Here are just a few of Petersen's local designs. This was his own home on 6th Street. This is the Union School in Suttons Bay. And this is a sterling example of what was then the new arts and crafts movement, bungalow style. This is on Cass Street. And here is its tiny version from Charlie Sawyer's Miniature Traverse City. Reverend Josiah Pennington, posed here with his 5 sons, helped establish the Traverse City Friends Meeting House. The Friends met in homes until Perry Hanna donated a lot at 5th and Oak Streets in 1892. Of Josiah's 5 sons, 2 played seminal roles in what is now the Interlochen Center for the Arts. Willis founded Camp Penlock. There's Willis on the far left. Camp Penlock for Boys on Duck Lake, and built the popular Hotel Pennington on Green Lake in 1909. Parker and his wife Christina founded Camp Interlochen, a private camp for friendly girls on Green Lake, and that ran from 1919 to 1943. The hotel became headquarters for the National Music Camp in 1927. Mary Knight Buck was born in Bohemia in 1849 and came to Traverse City as a very young child. After graduating from Kalamazoo College, she became a teacher and contributed poems and stories to several nationally circulated magazines. Mary was a charter member of the Ladies Library Association and co-wrote both a small collection of poems and a volume of Northern Michigan stories titled Along Traverse Shores. After her death in 1901, her husband published her poems as Songs from the Northland, and I was so excited to find a copy. Scholars have described both books as part of the knowledge base of civilization as we know it. The library remained one of only a very few ladies' libraries in the country until closing in 1949. The building was donated to become the city's first freestanding police station, and its more than 5,000 books became the seed for NMC's own library. And I do hope that there's time at the end for me to share one of Mary's poems. Emanuel Wilhelm's family arrived here from Bohemia in 1856, and Emanuel was born 6 years later. He worked on the family farm before heading west for adventure on cattle ranches and with railroad and mining crews. But he really got his start here with his brother AJ in 1886, when the two built Wilhelm Brothers Dry Goods on the corner of Union and 8th. It's now AT&T. But that was only the start for Emanuel, and in 1901, he announced he would build Traverse City's first skyscraper. At 5 stories, it dwarfed even the State Bank across Front Street. The building survived a fire in the 1970s, but it is no longer a skyscraper. Tony Novotny came to town as part of the Bohemian influx of the 1880s, looking for work as a lumberjack. On the way, he noticed plenty of fellow lumberjacks, but in his opinion at least, not nearly enough saloons. So in 1886, he opened the doors of Novotny's Saloon on Union Street, and it was clear he'd spared no expense on the beautiful mahogany furnishings and the fancy window drapery. It quickly became a gathering place for thirsty townsfolk, and still is today as the boot tractor. John Straub, here in 1941, long after his retirement, started out as a talented confectioner in Milwaukee. After he and his brother, Anton, moved to town, they built twin houses on 8th Street in 1900 and founded Straub Brothers and Amiati Candy Company. By 1904, their 60 candy girls were pumping out 3,000 pounds of treats a day. That's astonishing. The venture was so successful that they built a huge 4-story plant on West Front Street. But the market underwent an abrupt change in the 1920s from bulk candy to bars, and the Straubs lost out to Mars and Hershey. The company folded in 1929, an early casualty of the Great Depression, but their building lives on as North Peak Brewing. And finally, John Morgan, here with his wife, Ardvilla, on their 69th anniversary, was widely known as Vinegar John. This was due both to his occupation and apparently to his rather tart disposition. He came to town in 1892 and leased a cider mill from Perry Hanna. Just 3 years later, he constructed a state-of-the-art cold storage warehouse at the north end of Union Street that was proclaimed an engineering marvel. It grew into the Morgan Canning Company, one of the area's largest, until the 1970s. Morgan also cultivated an immense orchard just west of the city limit and was instrumental in forming the International Apple Association. It was Vinegar John who coined Traverse City's famous moniker, the cherry capital of the world. So that's it. I hope this has given you some appreciation of Perry Hanna's vision and the role that he and his neighbors played in the civic development of Traverse City. Are there any questions? Yes.
You mentioned a tramway
Yes.
for the original sawmills. What did that consist of?
I think it was the tramway from the original Boardman sawmill out to the docks. I think it was just a wood boardwalk essentially, and they used horses or oxen to get everything moving. Yes. Sorry, you're backlit.
That's okay. You have a delightful personality. You're perfect for this kind of.
Thank you.
Really,
Absolutely.
do you have, can you take time? You talked about you don't know if you have time to tell more. Can you just tell more if we want to stay?
sure.
I know I
Yeah,
can't.
Yeah, so this presentation is based on my book about Central Neighborhood, and there are copies there if you haven't seen them. Okay, good. Yeah, I can stay and talk if you have questions, but okay. Yes.
So of these early pioneers in Traverse City, are there generations of their families that are still in the area?
Yes,
I mean,
indeed.
can you sort of say, here's the Wilhelms or here's the Votrubas or?
Yes, absolutely.
And
There are
you have
still
that?
Wilhelms, there are still Votrubas. One of our audience members is a Whiting. Yeah, so, and that house, yeah, the house has been in the family, that same house, for 100 years. Yes.
Well, I really want to encourage people to buy Marty's book because it's just as much fun to read, almost as much fun as to hear Marty.
Well, I mean, necessarily, I had to cut out all kinds of great stuff to speak for just a half hour, so.
Plus, I want them out of my basement, please.
Thank you for the pitch. Yes.
Before we canonize Harry Hanna,
Yes.
I just wanted to raise the question of the lumber barons, of which I gather he was one of the greatest in lower Michigan. Have you read much about the fires that followed the cutting of northern lower Michigan? You hear about stories, the critics say that at times they would, lease, not rent, in other words, rent thousands of acres for like a 2-year period or something, never intending to
Cut it?
stay them, but no, never intending to develop them,
Right.
but simply denude them of the virgin forest, and that as a result, there were fires that sometimes spread from Lake Michigan and burned, for the lack of a fire department, all the way to Lake Huron and destroyed pretty much the vast forest up here. And meanwhile, people like Harry Hanna became fabulously wealthy. He was obviously a great leader, no doubt about that. But what do you know about the other side of the coin? And I assume in your reading, you're aware of the destruction of the land in the rivers.
I'm not well read on that. I will say that Perry Hanna, he got out of the business pretty early. I mean, decades and decades before a lot of his contemporaries did. So, I can't say that there weren't issues like that caused by Hanna Lay and Company. But he saw the writing on the wall pretty early and divested himself of his lumber holdings pretty early. I mean, in the 1880s, and the lumbering was going on well into the 20th century.
So from the lumber, but he built the city and helped others to build the city with that money.
And I'm like you, I was really leery of, as you say, canonizing him, because just not much on highly wealthy people. But the more I read about what he did and certainly what he did for Traverse City, the more I had to say, yeah, he's really a pretty good guy. I mean, I'm sure he had his detractors, but you don't hear about them much. Maybe they were just suppressed. I don't know. Yes, Peg.
Just sort of to add a little bit to your question. I don't know that much about Perry Hanna. I mean, I know what she knows. I haven't run across negative things about him, but who knows why. But as far as the conservation movement goes, the way I've sort of gotten it is that by and large, for right or wrong, people who were in the lumber industry, by and large, in the late 1800s, just didn't have the concept we have now. And that's not justifying it. It was just like not in their thought process that what they were doing could have such negative consequences. But a positive side of it is that in Northern Michigan and Michigan in general, we were clear cut a little bit later than places to the east of us. And the conservation movement that started in the 1920s and 30s and sort of spread nationwide had a very strong cohort here in Michigan, that because of the horrible destruction of the land that they were living in, Harold Titus, does anyone else in here know more than I do about Harold Titus? He was like, he's buried in Oakwood Cemetery, and he was one of the first people that began a conservation organization in Michigan. And I believe it was very early as far as the whole country went. And so not by Perry Hanna's intent whatsoever, but the fact that the lumber industry had been so destructive gave a push to the conservation movement, which then eventually grew into our modern day environmental. That's all I have to add to it.
Thanks, Meg. Yes, Stuart.
One of the guys that Theodore Roosevelt brought into his administration was the guy that clear cut a lot of New York and Pennsylvania. And after he did that, he took a turnabout and said, no, we shouldn't be doing this. So he helped Roosevelt get a lot of land into federal hands, so it wouldn't be clear cut.
You obviously have done tremendous research. So I'm just wondering how long you spent researching.
Well, the Central Neighborhood book was published 2 years after the Old Town book. So within that period was the research was done. And I have to say it was a chore, but it wasn't awful because so many of the people were prominent and there was more information about them. It was people like on 6th Street, 7th Street, 9th Street, 10th Street, where it got a little bit harder to dig up some of the stories. But it's so fascinating that, hardly work. So, yes. He did. He had a son, Julius, and 2 daughters. And Julius was groomed basically his whole life to take over the Hanalei Empire, but he ended up dying just a year after his father. So he didn't have much time to make his mark, I'll tell you. Yeah, it's kind of a sad story.
Inherited the house then after Julius, his wife Elsie. And she lived there until the 30s.
No, she sold it to the Legion after the First War.
She did,
Okay.
it was sold to the Legion.
Yes.
She built a house on East Bay, way out of town. Actually, it's like across from TAHS Market. And there's a tennis court there for you to go by. And her sister and husband, Bach Beers, was the husband who at the bank. It was all very closely held family corporation. Built the brick one next to the Christian Science Church. But then Elsie spent one winter on East Bay, decided that was ridiculous and switched houses. Because I remember
He
Jake
came back
telling
to
me he could
6th
walk
Street, yeah.
across the street or the road at East Bay and sighting his deer rifle because there was nothing out there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, the Zoom audience mentioned that they would love to hear a poem.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
So these are poems that, as I said, her husband, Mr. Buck, compiled, and they were ones she had done her whole life. And he divided them into 6 sections. And so one of the sections is children's verses. And I would like to read you a gastronomic feat I had left her at play in the garden, my 4-year-old daughter Louise, with her pretty wax doll in its carriage, as happy and sweet as you please. The kitten sat purring beside her, the doves walked about on the grass, the sunbeams shone down on her tresses. They all loved the dear little lass. I glanced now and then from the window and smiled at the motherly care with which she would tuck in her dolly and smooth the tow curls of its hair. Then, absorbed in my task, I forgot her for the space of 5 minutes or so, when a terrible shriek broke the silence and I rushed in affright to the door. Louise, with her dolly clutched tightly, came running, still screaming to me, then held up her poor waxen baby, that the cause of her grief I might see. Poor Tot, as she stood there before me with an air of such tragical woe, I had not the heart to upbraid her, though you'll smile at the reason, I know. Some mishap the doll had befallen, for her eyes had dropped back in her head, and left such a queer-looking object, 2 staring great holes in their stead. "Why, child," I exclaimed, half impatient, "you frightened me so with your cries." "Oh, mamma," she wailed, "I can't help it. My dolly has swallowed her eyes." So, very Victorian, but cute. So, anything else? Thank you so much.